I'm Alan Hunt. I'm the Director of Policy and Grants at the Musconetcong Watershed Association. And we have several other presenters joining us tonight. We have Doug O'Malley from Environment New Jersey. Doug can wave. We have Mike Pizarro from the Watershed Institute. We have Keith Pritchie from Trout Unlimited. And Bill Kibler from Raritan Headwaters. So I did bother to put people's professional titles in here, in part because I did want folks to understand that there are two lawyers in the room who work on policy here and one doctor who looks at policy too. So if we get a little wonky, please interrupt us and ask for any clarifying questions. But we are going to get into some of the meat behind water quality issues in the region and digging into some data that comes from DEP that we will be interpreting together. Let's see. And just so folks know, this is recorded. There we go. So this is going to be a river talk done in parts. So each section is going to have something a little bit different in it. What I would like to do first is introduce the Great Waters Initiative, which is something that the Musconetcong Watershed Association and several partners have been working on. So I'd like to introduce the project and how it came about and how it links to what we're seeing with changes in water quality and also potential threats to water quality across the state and in the region. So as I mentioned, the Great Waters project, it's a partnership, and we have several of the groups that are involved in it here. We have Trout Unlimited and the Watershed Institute and the Musconetcong Watershed Association. We're also working with the Delaware River Greenway Partnership, looks after the Delaware River, the New Jersey Highlands Coalition, and the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. Thank you. And we also are joined tonight with Raritan Headwaters, which isn't part of that group, but is one of the key members in the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. And so we'll be talking about some state policy issues and regional issues as well. There we go. And just so folks know, my ability to advance slides is a little slow. There we go. The Great Waters is also a region, and we chose this name, and it comes from a definition that the Environmental Protection Agency uses for exceptional recreational resources. They call them exceptional waters. So we said that's too long a word. We're going to call them Great Waters. And this generally overlaps with the trout fishing regions of Northwest New Jersey. It's not all about trout. Trout are really important, but they're one of the key reasons people come to visit this area of the state. It's linked by some unique geological features that provide cold, clean water to the rivers and streams, which is perfect for trout. So we're taking a regional approach, looking at these upper tributaries of the Delaware River watershed, and the Flatbrook, the Pollenskill, the Pequest, the Powhatan, the Lopakon, and the Musconetcong. The Raritan would be over here and then going out and draining to the Atlantic. It also has some similar topography and habitat, just like these rivers do. So I want to talk a little bit about what unifies this region, what makes them so great. Well, part of it is that there is a good amount of public land that's been preserved over time. Here's an example. This is a Point Mountain Reservation, part of the Hunterdon County Park System. It overlooks the Musconetcong Valley, and you can see 4 different mountain ridges from it, and resembles much of the region. Another great example where we get these perennial, fast-moving headwater streams, and which are often good areas to find brook trout. Great examples of Roaring Rock Park and Powhatan River in Washington Township. There's also a good number of trails throughout this region too. At state parks, one of these longer trails, and which is different sections, is the Morris Canal Greenway. The Morris Canal went through the Musconetcon, and the Powhatan watersheds went through Lake Apacon and Lake Musconetcon. And there's a number of recreational sites related to that. There's also a great number of wildlife management areas. For example, the Pequest Wildlife Management Area is nearly 5,000 contiguous acres. It houses one of the state's fish hatcheries and also some prime hunting grounds. It also provides farmland too, and has a number of rail trails that provide access to the watershed. And it's not just about recreation. People have homes along the rivers. Here's an example just outside of Hackettstown. And home ownership and vacation rentals are an important part of the region's economy and its identity. Agriculture is also an active part and provides a lot of scenic views. Between 1/3 and 40% of the farmland in this region, New Jersey, is preserved, and that's been through municipal, county, and state investments. And this happens to be my own farm about a month ago with a second cutting of hay along the Musconetcon River. The farmland preservation also provides for scenic views that people enjoy. Here's one example along Asbury-Anderson Road in the Musconetcon Valley. And the recreational uses can be for larger groups too. Like you get there on the Delaware River. The left part of this mountain is actually preserved by Warren County. It's the Marble Hill County Preserve, and it actually has part of the Warren Highlands Trail. As I mentioned, fishing is quite popular. This is at Stokes State Forest on the Big Flat Brook. It's a popular trout fishing stream. And this is again on the Musconetcon in Hampton Borough, an area that could look a little bit more urbanized. But as you can see, this gentleman's catching a pretty good sized rainbow trout that's been stocked in that park. We have a number of historic districts and scenic bridges. This is in Finesville, just upstream of here. A river was restored by removing an abandoned mill dam, and the water quality improved. And we know tourism is important to this region too. Like this person coming with their kayak, stopping in a local coffee shop in the Asbury Historic District. So you get the linkage of the recreation, the open space, and the economy. And likewise with some of our larger lakes, with Hopatcon State Park, for example, there are public swimming areas. The rivers really aren't for primary contact recreation or swimming, but some of our lakes are. And they can be impacted when the water quality changes. And people come throughout the state and spend money in these places, visit, have a good time, make memories. And when you look at this overall across the entire region, there's just about 65,000 acres of public land for hunting, about 40,000 acres of preserved farmland, preserving those scenic views, over 118 river access points for people to fish, boat, enjoy the rivers, 119 historic districts. We love our history in this part of the state, and a number of these districts are also the small towns, and it's the economic lifeline of the region. There's a number of public swimming areas and 2 national wild scenic rivers and 1 national water trail. So you can see all these resources, they ladder up. There's quite a number of them in the region, and that makes the fabric of what people want to come out and see. When we look at this on the economic side, it's not just about recreation and tourism. About 6 million people rely on the region for drinking water from the underground sources and also from reservoirs. There's 6.6 billion in annual free ecological services. So that's land that helps filter out and keep that drinking water supply clean. That's the forest cooling the atmosphere, pulling in carbon dioxide, providing wildlife habitat, providing hunting grounds. Statewide, there's 6.2 billion in wages for outdoor recreation, over 130,000 jobs. And maintaining that water quality and volume is really important for agriculture. We do have some industries, especially around the fruit and vegetable production, that do use groundwater and surface water for irrigation. And that supports the agritourism. People would like to go visit farmers markets and farm stands. And it's no surprise then that recreation, small businesses like bed and breakfasts, bait shops, hunting shops, boat rentals, dot the region, and they're part of the economic engine that is in the Great Waters region. So I just want to give folks a little bit of that context, because when we all drive through this area or visit it, this is often what we see, and I want to make sure that we keep that in mind while we talk about some of the water quality issues and that's going on in the region. So here's our outline. We're going to talk about some trends in land use development, what we know about existing water quality. This will be where a number of our speakers come in. We'll talk about local and state policy actions that can maintain and protect water quality. And we'll talk about what you can do too as an individual to support those actions or get involved in other ways. So I'm going to introduce this about some trends that we saw in development between 2014 and 2020. I've been with the Musconetcong Watershed Association for just over 5 years. So some of this predates me, but it was still kind of ongoing when I first started. The reason why I picked this picture is that this is that headwater stream. This is where all of our watersheds wind up being born, from small features like this. And so when you have a watershed that's forested or in agriculture, the stream's pretty much in its original form, maybe somewhat disturbed, but it's still providing its hydrological function of draining these highland areas and feeding streams, lakes, rivers below. And a number of these sites with streams like this have been proposed for development. And so that's one of the issues that we wanted to introduce. All right. One more person being admitted. Thank you for joining us. So one of the things I want to show was around 2014, what types of projects were going on in the watershed. So I made this map just to provide an example, something to help me track what was going on. And we had a few known places where there might be some water quality issues, like infrastructure, like dams or wastewater treatment plants. And that's what we have here in blue. We have some restoration activities or activities that are improving water quality. That's marked in green. And then we had some projects that we were aware of that were going on, which are marked in red. There's an abandoned oil tank farm. There is a large-scale housing development with a groundwater discharge sewer system being proposed near the river. There was a quarry that was coming back to life. When 2020 came around, a number of those projects were still being proposed to some degree or active in some degree. They also increased. We went to seeing what we had seen there, which is maybe a little typical of what we had seen before the recession. But then we started seeing new types of projects, like a natural gas power plant that would use the river for cooling water. We saw an asphalt recycling plant, some industrial developments, expansion of a scrap metal facility, some new facilities that would have stormwater discharge, and we also saw some warehouses being proposed. You can also see that other activities to restore the river increased as well during that time period. So what we wound up seeing is that, unlike in previous times when there was more development being proposed and converting land from agriculture or forest, these were more intensive water using projects. So something like a power plant, a quarry that we didn't know at the time whether it would actually have a discharge to the river as a dewatered, and in this case, it did turn out that they did not. An asphalt recycling facility, warehouses which have a very large surface footprint, new groundwater sewer discharge facilities, large-scale housing, industrial solar farms. And we had also seen that it looked like the interest for some farmland owners to engage in land preservation started to decline, perhaps in the face of some of these other industrial uses maybe paying more than what land preservation customarily paid. So what was driving all this, and what was changing? Well, around with the recession 2007, 2008, the housing demand that had been increasing had started to decline, and so there was a lull, say 2008 to 2014. We saw the retail sector shift from stores to online, so the demand for warehousing grew. The Penny's pipeline was proposed, and that natural gas plant was going to be fed by that pipeline. As I mentioned, the owners, farmland preservation may not have been as interested. And there's also just more industrial land demand, more demand for quarries, metal recycling. As the building industry picked back up, these sites that would serve that industry increased or expanded their operations. We also saw at the same time that some of the policies that protect water quality and headwater streams, that the rules have been changed in ways that the headwater streams wouldn't be protected as much. And this was with the freshwater wetlands and the flood hazard area rules. We also saw this with the water quality management planning, which is what would advise about where a sewer discharge would be appropriate or not appropriate. We also saw some legal situations change. The Council on Affordable Housing continued to not really function, and it wasn't active in the citing of affordable housing settlements. So settlements were pursued through the court very aggressively to make sure that those obligations would be met. But a court generally struggles with addressing environmental issues or issues where there's a lot of science involved. We also saw the emergence of harmful algal blooms in 2019. So we saw a number of changes economically, policy-wise, legal, and also with the environment. But some things stayed the same. We're in New Jersey. We have great proximity to urban markets. There's going to be a demand for housing. We have interstate highways and good transportation. Farming is still, economically challenged in our region. It has to compete with these higher land uses. And we see that people continue to use recreational areas, that they continue to visit places with water access, and this increased recently with through the pandemic. Some things that don't change is the bedrock. We have this wonderful carbonate bedrock. It's kind of like a Swiss cheese. Water filters in, cool water comes out. But what can happen is the water can be warmed, or it can convey pollutants quickly to the river or stream. And we also saw that our total volume of water supplies pretty much maxed out for this region. Some areas do have additional water availability, but most of the water is obligated already through existing drinking water and wastewater systems. Even if it's not already tapped, the allocations have been provided, and in some cases exceed what's available. So what wound up happening? The combination of all these trends, well, we saw that more hilly highlands terrain, those places where the streams come from, like in that photograph, became available for development that weren't available for development before. We saw the regulated status of partly mapped intermittent streams disputed in the courts about whether the DEP was following its own rules or following what the EPA said. And as I mentioned, things changed in this time period around that. We saw more demand for building materials and industries that supported that. We saw some of these former undeveloped industrial zones or mill or factory sites being redeveloped or being sought for development. And we also saw that there was more demand from groups like ours or Raritan Headwaters being asked by our members to participate in planning board meetings or land use board meetings, or be active on DEP permit applications. So what we wound up doing to address some of this is we formed this Great Waters Project. And that's why I wanted to introduce the project at the beginning, was that it was a way for us to develop the capacity, work together, leverage the strengths of state organizations, regional organizations, other watershed organizations, to develop consensus and coordinate strategies to provide resources for municipalities to develop better planning, to conduct outreach, to support public engagement and policies, and also to try and get some of those state level policies to better protect water resources. All right. So this is where I get a transition out of how we got here with this project around the Great Waters and why we're talking about water quality and some trends around land use change. And we're going to talk about water quality trends, because one thing I always think about, this is my daughter in the river in the Musconetcon by the Beattystown Musconetcon Wildlife Management Area. Had a great time out there, taking some photos of the watershed. And I think about what we leave behind for our children. It's always on my mind. And we have with us Mike Pizarro and Doug O'Malley, who are engaged in state policy to provide us some information around what the DEP calls integrated reports. It's the way that the Clean Water Act is set up for the state and the EPA to know what water quality is at a state level and across the country. So Mike and Doug, would you introduce yourselves and just tell me when to advance the slides?
Great. Thank you, Alan. My name is Mike Pizarro, and I'm the Policy Director of the Watershed Institute. Many of you may remember it as the Stony Brook Millstone Watershed Association. We're in central New Jersey, part of that Raritan Basin. Doug, do you want to go next?
Sure. So great to see so many familiar faces. My name is Doug O'Malley. I'm the Director of Environment New Jersey. We do state level advocacy. We're based in Trenton. We also represent 20,000 citizen members across the state on state level work, right? And water policy has always been one of the issues that we've worked on through the years. So great to be here with you all.
And Doug, I guess I'm going to take the first couple slides, and if you want to jump in with any extra commentary, please do so. Perfect. All right, so you know what this is, even though you can't see it very clearly, I'm glad Alan put this graph up, or this chart of the state. So that orange that a lot of the state is covered in is not good, and you will see that a good chunk of that state is in that orange color. And we'll sort of go into that why. So if you want to go to the next slide, as Alan said, this water quality report that the Department of Environmental Protection issues as part of the Clean Water Act, we are required to issue this report every 2 years. And it provides a list of all the waters in New Jersey that meet standards and all the waters in New Jersey that do not meet standards. So again, this report is brought out every 2 years. And here's just one of the graphs that I think is sort of the most telling in sort of the big picture takeaway. So this is 2018 and 2020. New Jersey is a little bit behind in its reporting, so they combined these two reports into one. And again, that sort of orange, maybe it should be red, are waters that don't meet standards. So all waters in New Jersey have designated uses: aquatic life trout, water supply, recreation, fish consumption, and shellfish. So all waters are designated these uses. It's a part of the Clean Water Act. And in New Jersey, all waters have aquatic life. So think macroinvertebrates. And all waters are designated for water supply. So you see that, just for aquatic life general, a vast majority of the waters that New Jersey monitors are not meeting standards clean enough for a healthy aquatic life. And this is just a snapshot in time. But Alan, if you go to the next slide, I pulled up the same report from 2010. And they sort of changed the order, but that middle, aquatic life, and again, they did this in red this time versus the orange. You see for aquatic life, a good chunk of New Jersey, the waters that we are monitoring, are not meeting standards. That means it's not healthy enough, it's not clean enough for the macroinvertebrates and other aquatic life to survive and thrive. And this is a snapshot from 2010. I actually went back to 2004, and the way DEP sort of displayed the data wasn't really apples to apples. But what you will see if you go back and look through these reports over time, and I think DEP says this in the 2016 report, our worst waters Now, the ones that are most polluted are getting better, but our highest quality waters are degrading. So we're sort of meeting towards, I have 2 teenage boys, so we're sort of meeting towards that, average C grade. And I know that's not how water quality data is actually done, but we're going to mediocrity. And as I said to my kids, if that's the best you can do, awesome. But I know you can do better. And, I know New Jersey can meet standards and can actually have high quality water, but we're not there yet. And sort of the trends are there. So Alan, if you want to go to the next slide. And so this is again from the 2018 to 2020 report, and just that graph broken down to percentages. So 19% of the waters that New Jersey monitors, and we don't monitor every single waterway, but we do monitor sort of a representative chunk of them, are meeting standards. So that means 68% are not. And again, that's been relatively standard. And if you think about our worst waters getting better, if you think about the origination of the Clean Water Act, which we're rapidly approaching the 50th anniversary of the release of the Water Pollution Control Act, we had waters that were on fire and were basically dumping grounds for industrial waste. So yes, waters are getting better. The ones that were most heavily polluted from industrial waste are getting cleaned up as we are addressing that point source pollution. But as Alan mentioned, the development pressures that are occurring throughout the state, Great Waters region is not alone. Most of the other state is sort of under the same, or if not increased pressure, is our land use, the way we're developing our land. So lands that were never subject to industrial processes are now being subject to land use changes, our stormwater polluted runoff, and those are why the waters are sort of degrading. And DEP and those reports will say the amount of land development is the strongest indicator of the health or lack of that in our waters. All right, and then Doug, I think you have the next couple slides.
Yeah, so let's move on to kind of the corollary here of what do we actually do when we see impairment, right? And the ideal scenario is under the Clean Water Act, we create essentially a pollution diet for waterways that are impaired and are not reaching aren't reaching their fully their full status. Right, so the total maximum daily load, or TMDLs, as we call them, that essentially is a pollution diet. We have, and we'll do a compare and contrast in just a little bit, but I want to kind of give a little bit of an overview of where we are, because unfortunately, TMDLs, the promise of the TMDLs has never been truly implemented under the Clean Water Act. Certainly, New Jersey, I would argue, on a national basis. And there's a myriad of reasons for that, but the reality right now is that we have 2,500 segments of waterways that are that have a listing right under low, medium, and high, and there are only 10 listed for high priority, right? So you want to talk about triage? That is not an effective strategy. And there are many reasons for this. Part of it is that the legal enforcement, to be able to have a cudgel to force state agencies like DEP to actually implement TMDLs has always fallen short. And I'll let the lawyers on the line kind of talk about that. But I remember early in my career being in a courtroom in Trenton and kind of realizing quickly that this had been a long case and it wasn't necessarily getting better. And unfortunately, because of the lack of legal enforcement on TMDLs, that has meant that the DEP has kind of taken a hear no evil, see no evil approach. Or the other way to think of it, if you're an Eagles fan, is that it's a little bit like Hotel California, right? You can check in, but you can never leave. And when we think about how DEP has created this kind of ongoing, endless TMDL process, it has, in the latest integrated report for 2018-2020, it basically provides a get out of jail free card, which is, if you can't meet the requirements of a TMDL, you can defer to a watershed restoration plan or a watershed-based plan that as an effective alternative. And while that is true, the concern is that the DEP is not actually enforcing and implementing those alternative plans. It's not coming up with enforceable restrictions on permits. So we effectively have TMDLs kind of in theory, but not in practice. What that means is we also have a very severe backlog of TMDLs. It's harder, obviously, for local nonprofits like Musconetcong Watershed Association to be able to raise funding because there are TMDLs that should be on the list that aren't, and certainly for the ones that are, there's no enforceable strategy, and this ultimately is a violation of the Clean Water Act, and it is an overall concern because you essentially have permits that are going out under a broad array of parts of the DEP, whether it's Coastal Area Review Act, whether it's freshwater wetlands, whether it's flood hazard control. You are pushing out permits and not actually looking at what the pollution diet should be or having any kind of enforcement on the TMDL that's there. So, I just want to kind of give that picture of part. This is part of the reason we are not seeing increased water quality is that we are not actually using the tools of the Clean Water Act to create pollution diets for our waterways. And so as Alan and Mike have discussed, as we've seen increased non-point source pollution in the Great Waters watershed, we aren't coming up with a plan to solve it. And this is to put a fine point on this is pre-2008. This is both bacteria / fecal coliform, total phosphorus. If you go to the next slide, DP again kind of changed the criteria, right? So it's no longer using fecal coliform, it's just using E. coli. Even though they're changing the definition, right? You can see that's a pretty big swath of blue that we're looking at, and that's the overall concern here is that we are not seeing a trend that's getting better. We are at the best staying stable as a mediocre C, as Mike described. And in parts of the state, obviously, we are getting worse. We're seeing more TMDLs without enforcement. So with that, let me turn it back over. And then, of course, my daughter desperately wants my attention too, which I'll get to Elsa in a moment.
You need the password.
Exactly. Who better to forget the password than her father? But let me turn it back to you, Alan, as we move on. And I actually, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong. Do we want to keep moving on? Do we want to take a pause here to take questions?
So we do have a time to take some questions. I think once Keith and Bill and I share some of the other water quality, but and we're actually looking forward to have a good discussion about that. I want to make sure we get everyone's perspective in there, and then we'll take some questions. Thanks,
Super.
Doug.
Yep. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Doug and Mike. Here's how to contact them. They are pretty accessible and chatty folks. They don't mind talking with folks. Next, we're going to have Keith Fritchie from Trout Unlimited speak about the Upper Delaware region, so more aligned with the Great Water region. So we're kind of getting a little bit smaller with each presentation that we're looking at the geographic area for next.
Sure. Thanks, Alan. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith. I'm a habitat restoration coordinator for Trout Unlimited in the northwest corner of the state. And yeah, we're going to be talking about actually temperature impairments in the Upper Delaware region. So kind of giving a vignette on one particular water quality parameter that I especially like talking about, but other people might find interesting for other reasons as well. So Alan, can you go to the next slide, please? And so why are we talking about temperature when there's many other water quality parameters we could be talking about? So first, from my organization's perspective, we view temperature and increasing temperatures as the most pressing threat to wild trout persistence in New Jersey, and also a major threat to our recreational fisheries in northwestern New Jersey, which kind of expend and also generate significant amounts of money in New Jersey each year. But we also have, many different streams in New Jersey or Northwest New Jersey with trout designated uses. They're kind of concentrated in the northern half of the state and especially the northwest half of the state. So temperature and trout kind of go together. And so this is really relevant to our region. And we also, beyond trout, know that water quality or water temperature is kind of a master variable in streams. It impacts many biogeochemical processes, including things like harmful algal blooms, nutrients transformation that going downstream, even toxicity of some chemical constituents like ammonia. So even if you don't care about trout, you might care about water temperature if these are concerns to you. And finally, we can kind of view temperature as sort of a problem with some actionable solutions. So a lot of the different restoration and conservation techniques that Trout Unlimited and many of our partners engage in are ways to maintain or even alleviate temperature stress. So things like riparian restoration, stormwater management, dam removal, groundwater protection, and some of these discharge permit reviews that we've been talking about. So that's why I think about temperature. Alan, can you go to the next slide, please? So how does the state actually determine whether or not streams are thermally impaired? Well, really simply, they pick temperature metrics to evaluate temperature data against for each of these streams. So these temperature metrics that the state uses are kind of shown on the bottom. I'm not going to go into the details of how these metrics are set, but all I want to show you with this slide is that these are biologically relevant metrics that do relate to different aspects of the growth, performance, and survival of both our wild and stocked fish. Alan, can you go to the next slide, please? So yeah, sorry, this is kind of a three-part animation. So what I want to do is just talk through some of the results from the most recent integrated report that Mike and Doug were speaking on that focus particularly on how well streams actually met thermal criteria in northwestern New Jersey. So in the far left panel, what you can see is the results from the most recent integrated report. And so this is the Great Waters region. The Musconetcong is the kind of the southernmost set of polygons that you see, or small watersheds. And then going further north up into the Flatbrook and some of the smaller streams in Montague in the tri-state region. So each of these kind of polygons that I'm describing are they're called assessment units. So the state determines, first of all, if there is temperature data within each of those units that they can use to assess whether or not streams are meeting their temperature requirements. And then if there is those data, they can kind of evaluate them and categorize those different assessment units as either attaining temperature criteria. So that means they meet the standard, non-attaining, that red color, they're not meeting the standard, or they just don't have the data there. And so those are those beige colored catchments. And so on the far left, what we can see from the draft report is that more than 50% of assessment units in our region are actually attaining their temperature criteria for trout designated uses. So that seems relatively good, considering that New Jersey is a relatively warm place for trout to begin with. More than 50% attainment isn't too bad. However, in the middle panel, what we are also showing here is that in addition to data that the state collects, many partners are concerned with water temperature as well and collect data on water temperature. So each of these red dots is a site where we monitor temperature, either TU or many of our partners, including the Nature Conservancy, MWA, as well as the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife. So we have more than 140 sites across Northwest New Jersey where we're monitoring temperatures, and we have those data available. And the bulk of this data is collected under a state-approved quality assurance plan and is submitted to a database that the state should be using when they're developing their draft report. However, what you can see in the far right is that when we reanalyze those data ourselves, considering the criteria that we showed on the previous page, we actually see that what the data show on the ground is not what's really being, doesn't seem to be what's being reported right now in the far left in the report. So when we analyze our own data, we see that less than 25% of assessment units in the Great Waters region actually are meeting our temperature standards. And that may just be because we're covering a lot more streams than the state can currently cover with their own data collection. So Alan, you can go to the next slide. Really just the take-home messages, just from a temperature standpoint, is that the majority of Northwest New Jersey's waters do seem to be thermally impaired. And that's, including almost all the Musconetcong, Pohatcong, the Lopat, and the Flatbrook. So these wild trout waters that are really important to our organization and to many others. And this doesn't really currently correspond with what the integrated report seems to conclude. What the report does show is that of all those watersheds with impairments to the trout designated use, more than 3/4 of those are impaired because of thermal exceedances of their criteria. So temperature is definitely kind of the most frequent stressor of our trout streams across the entire state. However, only one temperature TMDL has actually been developed across the entire state. So there seems to be maybe a little bit of a disconnect between the most common stressors in our trout waters and some potential solutions that we can be putting in place. And so finally, we just found that given the large disconnects between what our own data show and what the state is currently reporting, we do think that we should be better interacting with DEP to make sure that they have kind of all the data that's applicable to their analysis and report, so those current reports actually reflect current water quality conditions in New Jersey. So I appreciate your time, and I'll take any questions after Bill. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Keith. We appreciate that. Bill Kibler, you're up next. Bill's at Raritan Headwaters. He's the policy director.
Yeah, Alan, thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and it's good to see folks on today. So there's just a few things I wanted to touch on, try to give, I guess, folks a snapshot of what's going on the other side of Schooley's Mountain, over in the Raritan, which obviously does not drain into the Delaware. Alan, I love this shot, nice shot down at the Neshannock. So a few perspectives from our watershed on the statewide water quality, and in particular on the 303D list that Alan spoke about and Mike and Doug touched on in a lot more detail. I think one of the things that's important for folks to know, Mike and Doug talked about there's a half a dozen different uses, designated uses, that waters in the state are supposed to meet under the Federal Clean Water Act. And one of the important things to know is that meeting one of those criteria is not enough. If your water body is designated for 4 or 5 or 6 of those designated uses, and I'm going to, for the moment, ignore shellfish because that's a coastal issue. But in order to meet the requirements of the Federal Clean Water Act, a water body needs to meet all of its designated uses. That's important because in the bulk of the state, and in fact, probably about 99% of the state, our waters don't meet all of their designated uses. In my watershed, on the other side of Schooley's Mountain here in Raritan Headwaters, none of our waters meet all of their designated uses. Most of our waters meet 1, 2, maybe 3 designated uses, but not all of them. And so where is that coming from? So I'm going to talk a little bit about changes in land use pressure that we've seen in our watershed. It may be a little bit different from what you're seeing in the Musconetcong, but I think generally the trends are similar. Alan talked about how development quieted down during and after the time when the economy crashed in 2008. We saw the same thing in our watershed. In 2008, we had really had 2 things that greatly impacted development pressure and limited development pressure for a while in our watershed. The first was the implementation of the Highlands Act in 2004. The northern 2/3 of my watershed is in the Highlands. So when the Highlands Act came into play, that made development in the Highlands more challenging and more expensive for developers, and it limited development pressures in the northern part of my watershed, not in the southern part, but in the northern part. And what we saw happen after 2004 was if developers couldn't develop in the Highlands, then the next best thing was to develop in the Piedmont. And so we saw significantly increasing development pressures in the southern part of our watershed. When the economy tanked in 2008, like most of the state, we saw development pressures drop significantly, and things got quiet for a lot of years. That is not the case anymore. We are now seeing development ramped up significantly. We're seeing a lot more development pressure, both in the Highlands and in the Piedmont now. What we're seeing primarily in our watershed is proposals for high-density residential development. What we tended to see prior to 2008 was high-end, low-density residential development, McMansions, in a word. What we're seeing now is condos, townhouses, those sorts of developments, high density, 150, 200, 300 units at a time, being developed on what was farmland. The reason for that, or at least a reason for that, part of it is just the demand for additional housing. A big part of it, a major driver, is the demand for municipalities to meet their affordable housing obligations. So developers will come with a 150 unit or a 200 unit development, promise to put in 30 or 40 affordable housing units, which allows the municipality to meet their affordable housing demands or their requirements. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of these pressures come from now. I've been working on one in Clinton Township that was proposed recently. We have one now in Far Hills that's proposed, and they're all fairly similar. They're developers like Pulte doing high density development. So those are kind of the changes in land use pressures that we're seeing. I don't see those pressures going away. As the economy improves, I expect that they will actually increase. So what are we seeing in terms of water quality trends on the Raritan side? You heard discussion of statewide water trends. We're seeing similar things here. We monitor 74 sites in our watershed every year using the high gradient macroinvertebrate index, which is the procedure that DEP recognizes for biological monitoring of stream quality. And our water quality, as Mike pointed out, is trending towards the mediocre. As a headwaters area, that is not what we want to see, because we were traditionally we were an area with higher quality waters. One of those areas that Mike was talking about that had high quality waters, and now we're seeing that drift down towards the mediocre. There are certain things that are driving that. One of them is the thing that Keith talked about, and that's temperature. We continually see issues with temperature in our streams. That is in part a function of increased development. It's also obviously in part a function of climate change, and it's something we're struggling with. We're also seeing increasing issues with bacteria in our watershed. The bacteria that gets the big headlines these days is HABs, hazardous algal blooms. And everybody's paying attention to HABs, which is great, don't get me wrong, but the conditions that are ideal for HABs, which is warm water and stormwater runoff from the landscape that brings nutrients into the water, phosphorus and nitrates, are also the same conditions that are ideal for fecal coliform. Same conditions. Fecal coliform evolved in systems where they need warm water and they got to be fed. And that's what we see. We see incredible, some truly incredible bacteria counts. We did some bacteria counts in Lake Solitude, which is in a section of the South Branch in High Bridge, where there's an impoundment there. And the surface water quality standard for coliform bacteria is something like 220 colonies per 100 milliliters, and it doesn't really matter. The number is not critically important, but 100 milliliters is about the size of a tennis ball. And it's just, for argument's sake, it's a little over 200. Let's just say 200. When we were sampling Lake Solitude during the summer, we got fecal coliform counts over 19,000. Over 19,000. And coliform bacteria, depending on the variety of coliform bacteria, if it's E. coli, can be every bit as dangerous, in fact, more so than HABs. It tends not to get the press that HABs get, but it's a serious condition everywhere, and it's obviously a serious issue for drinking water. In our watershed, we've got Spruce Run and Round Valley reservoirs, which are the third and the first largest reservoirs in the state of New Jersey. So when we see bacteria issues like that, we get really concerned. Sometimes we focus a little bit too much on bacteria, I think, because people are like, yeah, it's bacteria, no big deal, we can treat for that. But bacteria, like temperature, as Keith was mentioning, it's kind of a canary in the coal mine. And the issue with bacteria is we find that if we have high coliform counts, it also means that there are high levels of other bacteria in the water that are more difficult and more expensive to test for than fecal coliform. So it's an indicator for us. And when we see those bacteria levels go up, we get very concerned about water quality, both for contact recreation, for fishing, as well as for drinking water quality. Same thing for temperature, and Keith talked about that. So in terms of policy changes to protect water quality, we're working to get the department to address the implementation of TMDLs. The previous speakers talked about that. There are challenges to TMDLs. They are very difficult to implement. I recognize that. But the thing about TMDLs is that right now, they really are the only tool that we have under the Clean Water Act to address non-point source pollution, stormwater pollution. We're pretty effective in New Jersey at addressing point sources, factory discharges, wastewater treatment discharges, but we are not good at addressing stormwater discharges. And TMDLs are not a perfect tool, but we haven't developed anything better. So we need to continue to work with the department to implement the TMDLs that have been drafted, that have been written, and to improve the TMDLs that are in place. So one of the challenges we have with the 303D list, and this kind of ties into the TMDL thing, this is kind of my last complaint, and then I'll be quiet. One of the challenges we have, at least on our side of the mountain, and I think this is true elsewhere, if a water is impaired, let's say for temperature, because we have several sections, several stream segments in our watershed that are impaired for temperature. What happens with those water bodies when they're listed as impaired is they go into an annex on the 303D list if a TMDL has been written. So once there's a TMDL in place, they go off into an annex and they no longer show up on the main 303D list, which leaves this false impression that this problem, temperature in this case, that's what we're talking about, has been addressed, when in fact it has not. We have this issue with temperature. We have this issue largely with bacteria. We absolutely have this issue with nutrients like phosphorus and nitrates. And I think that we will continue to have this issue until we can get the department to not just list waters on the 303D list and not just write a TMDL, but actually implement the TMDL and enforce those requirements. And that's what I've got, Alan, and I'm happy to participate in the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Bill, for joining us. All right, so I'm going to share some perspectives from the Musconetcon. So some of this will sound pretty much the same from what other folks have said. So the Musconetcon is a national wild and scenic river, and we also have New Jersey's only national water trail running from Lake Hopatcong down to the Delaware River at Regelsville. So it's a place where Congress and the Department of Interior have considered it a national resource for recreation. Our DEP looks at the type of recreation that should be happening on our river as secondary contact. So this is fishing and boating. We have an in 2000, actually in the late 1990s, and a TMDL was written in 2003. So we're one of those few water bodies that has gotten the TMDL for one of its impairments. But we're not attaining that secondary contact, the fishing and boating use with our bacteria levels, and we're not, and that also means we're not achieving our primary contact use. And we know people swim and wade and tube in the river. So we have this conundrum. We have a great recreational resource for fishing and for boating and for the scenic and historic resources. We want to encourage people to enjoy it so that they care about it and that it's a vital part of their life and that they want to protect it. And at the same time, we have water quality data telling us that we've got some limitations around recreational use. So what does this really look like when you drill down into the 303D list? This is supposed to be a busy slide. So over time, and this is like what Doug and Mike were talking about, but just for the Musconetcon, the number of impairments increased over time. So this, you can't look at this as total because some of these get graduated out when they become a TMDL. So the bacteria TMDL from 2003 no longer counts as an impairment because now it has a TMDL. It's odd. It makes it apples to oranges sometimes on this. But over time, we can see that the number of impairments is increasing. And so what is an impairment? What type of parameters do we see? Well, I mentioned bacteria because we were thinking about recreation with those recreation designations. Some of these are arsenic, which is geological, and there's really not much that can be done to mitigate for that. And it primarily affects anybody who's using as a public drinking supply. So we're lucky in the Musconetcon, the surface water of the Musconetcon isn't used as a drinking water supply. So that one is relatively minor. But we do see some impairments for pH, temperature, E. coli, and some of the other tributaries. In the lakes, we see some more toxic things like PCBs. It's the fluid that's used in transformers. And we usually see that in more industrial areas. Parts of the upper watershed, the Musconetcon, is where there was a heavy munitions industry, partly related to Picatinny Arsenal. That's no longer there, but we have some legacy pollutants that we're lucky we don't have in the lower part of the watershed. But what you can see happening here from 2012 and 2014, 2018 and 2020 is we're getting more impairments being identified by DEP for pH and temperature and bacteria on the river, but also its tributaries, its streams, which is why I made this rather busy slide, was to show how not just the main stem where you're kind of accumulating a bit more of the water and maybe more pollutants, you're getting it more in the tributaries now, in the headwaters, very much like what Bill was saying, what he sees in his watershed. And, you know, our water quality staff do monitor sites throughout the watershed. We're still analyzing a lot of our data around that. This was a big data collection year, and we don't have all of our data in yet. But if we were just looking at the DEP data and we wanted to represent this in something a little bit less busy than the previous slide, this is how it might look on the landscape, where we have some of the PCBs, as I mentioned, up here, and some of the more industrial products. The AS is arsenic. So in the Musconetcon, in general, the water quality improves as you go downstream, and there's more of a dilution effect. However, when we look at temperature, and this is something that we did with Trout Unlimited, the first time we did this, it was just a few sites, and what was done on one day at one time, a bunch of volunteers stuck a thermometer in the river and streams at all different places and took a temperature reading. So what we see in the Musconetcon, it runs hotter in the upper part of the watershed, and it runs a little bit cooler in the middle. When we repeated this, and we found this really interesting, this is using the same temperature ranges that Keith was looking at for the trout. The red is where it's going to be stressful for the trout. The blue, the dark blue, is where we're getting good groundwater sources from our underground aquifers, from the limestone and our carbonate bedrock. When we did this again in July of this year, we saw some of these tributaries themselves have some pretty high temperatures, which was a bit surprising, I think. And when we combined temperature from multiple data sources from 2021, we have a more robust picture, and we can see that the main stem, the main part of the Musconetcon is generally running warm for trout or too hot, and we have tributaries that run cooler. So the challenge with the Musconetcon here is, how do we connect up those cool tributaries through parts of the river that might be too hot for the fish to breed, but are cool enough for them to survive and get to those refuge areas that are those streams where they can breed and feed and not be stressed. That's just one example of how temperature plays out when you're looking at very specific watersheds or very specific streams, and bring it down all the way from the state level. All right, so let's transition into some discussion here, because I bet folks have some questions. So I was going to seed this discussion and with a question here, and I thought maybe Doug or Keith or Bill might have a question, be able to add some thoughts here. Is, when you think about this from your perspective, what do you think is going on with water quality in our region? Do you think we're on the cusp of it declining, or that's going to maintain itself with things the way they are? Do you think it's going to be improving, and if so, how? And if folks have questions that they want to ask the panel, or toss out there, you can put a question in the chat, you can raise your hand, or I do have my screen on and I can see everyone. You can kind of wave your hand if you want to, or you can use the bottom of the toolbar. You'll see that there's something that lets you choose your expressions, and one of those things you can do is raise hand. So any of those will work. So,
hey, Alan, let me be the harbinger of doom, because somebody's got to be the bad guy, right? Might as well be me. My concern is that everywhere in the world, we are feeling the impacts of climate change. We have been for the last 50 years, but it's taken us a while to recognize it. I think our water quality, as we know it in northern New Jersey, is going to continue to be threatened, to be challenged by climate change. Because what that means is higher water temperatures, and higher water temperatures mean lower dissolved oxygen. That combination of low dissolved oxygen and high temperature is really ideal for anaerobic bacteria, whether it's HABs or fecal coliform or others. So I think we've got a tough road ahead of us. That said, because I don't want anybody to go out and step in front of a bus, I think here in northern New Jersey, we're better situated than probably anywhere in the state to be climate resilient, if you will, because we have the opportunity. This is a great picture for that, really. You can see forests here, you can see trees, you can see some aquatic vegetation. We have opportunities here to protect our water quality and to fight to improve it. But folks need to recognize that we do have a fight ahead of us. Part of that is because of climate change. Part of it is going to be because of increased pressure, population pressures, development pressures. One of the things people learned during COVID is they don't need to live in a city if they don't want to. And lots of folks want to live in a city, but lots of folks have decided they don't. And they figured out that they can move out here and work remotely. That's going to put increased pressure on us. And I don't blame folks for wanting to live out here. It's a great area. But recognize that that combination of development, increased development pressure, which has always been our challenge, coupled with climate change, means we've got our work cut out for us.
I see we have one question in the chat, and we have Beth had also raised her hand. I'll read the one out in the chat, and maybe Beth would like to ask her question after that. The world's become a lot more complicated. How long and to what degree have watershed groups been monitoring microplastics, PFAS, and other chemical elements of a complicated society? What have we learned? How can they be removed from our headwaters and our streams if they can? Can we guess at the long-term consequence of consumption of these materials as they work their way up in their food chain? So that's an interesting question, because I don't think either of those is part of the normal monitoring of the integrated reports. And there's a whole other host of materials and compounds which aren't either. Does anyone want to take that one?
I'll address it from our side of the mountain, Alan, and then anyone else who wants to weigh in can. Over at Raritan Headwaters, we've been running a well test program since 1974. And the reason we implemented that was because most folks up here, as you all know, rely on wells for their drinking water. And there isn't any way to know if your well water is safe unless you're testing it. It's not like a public drinking water system. So at the time, there was no one who provided that service. So we just started doing it, and we've kind of been doing it ever since. The program has evolved over the decades, and we do now provide testing for things like PFOA, PFNAs, that the whole family of evolving PFOA chemicals. It's expensive because the lab work is expensive. So it's, doing a test for coliform is about $25. Doing one for PFOA is a couple of hundred. So it's not an easy thing to do. But the capacity, the ability for people to test their drinking water for those emerging contaminants is out there. We've been tracking emerging contaminants. We don't have enough data yet to really have an idea what we're looking at for trends. But we've also been testing for and tracking microplastics. And we're starting to find microplastics even in groundwater now in New Jersey. So that is a major concern. The answer is yes, they're there. Once they get into groundwater, like most other contaminants, they're much more difficult to remove. We can treat for things like PFOAs. We can treat drinking water, well water, for example, for microplastics, but it's not cheap. The much better, the much less expensive approach is to keep them out of the water in the first place and to do away with plastics to the maximum extent we can. That's my 2 cents worth.
So I'll add in quickly to that. Thank you both bills on that front. So just on PFAS chemicals overall, this is obviously a statewide issue. So what Bill was referencing and the testing they've done, obviously there was a Private Well Testing Act as well. Generally, PFAS hasn't been on people's radar screens. New Jersey has some of the highest levels of PFAS contaminants out of any state in the country. And that's just based on our industrial history, right? So that's not to say that Northwest New Jersey is immune to that. But if we look at kind of the concentration of industrial activity across the state, it's less concentrated, in the Great Waters region. it comes from, it's basically PFAS are kind of solvents, right? The kind of Teflon like chemicals of the world. The good news, and I want to just, state here, this is not for well water, this is obviously for surface water, is that the state through the Drinking Water Quality Institute has taken some of the strongest actions in the nation. This was also promulgated into rules from DEP to have incredibly strict standards for PFAS chemicals. And the good news is from a surface water perspective, you can filter out PFAS, with relatively affordable filtration. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because we're doing it for surface water doesn't mean that you can do that very easily for every private well in the state. But it is a kind of indication that we're not kind of permanently stuck. On the microplastics issue, and this is where I also appreciate this question because there is not an easy solution. So Bill, you're also getting at what are the long-term consequences of consumption of these materials? This is a known unknown. We do not know what those impacts will be. We can guess that obviously bioaccumulation is never good for for those individuals that are high up in the food chain like us. What we do know is that there are many reasons to be reducing our overall plastic use in the state, and New Jersey has been taking a leadership role with specifically the ban of single-use plastic bags, which will go into effect next May, as well as polystyrene, which also has been found. Styrene contaminants has been found, throughout surface waters throughout the state. So there are, that's not to say that's going to get rid of microplastics, but there increasingly is a movement to work to reduce the just rapid explosion of plastics in the state and the country.
And if I may just add, while the recent DEP regulations on PFAS and PFOA doesn't require treatment, it did alter what's called the Private Well Testing Act and those regulations. So when you go to sell your property, or I think it's every 5 years, if you're a rental landlord, you have to test. The act doesn't require treatment, but at least has to require testing and notification of either the buyer or the tenant of what the results of that testing is. So it's a step in the right direction. At least you know what you're drinking, and you can take measures to protect yourself. But at least that is there from a private well aspect.
I'd just like to actually comment real quickly, Alan, if I could. Just more generally, what I think about and what other folks who think about wild trout might think about is that with some of these emerging contaminants, especially those that might be more kind of concentrated or focused in our groundwater right now, some animals that are particularly dependent on groundwaters, like our wild trout in New Jersey's waters, will potentially more exposed to those emerging contaminants than other species, just because they use groundwaters for cold, climate resilient habitat. So I think Doug is completely right, from a trout perspective too, that is a known unknown what those effects might be, on the ecological side of things in the food chain. But that's just something that we think about too. And it's good that we're now thinking about ways to identify groundwaters in the Muskie and other systems where they interact with surface waters, and maybe could be places where we could do some testing. Thanks.
Great. Well, we had a good all-around panel response on that question. Beth, I know you've been waiting a while to ask a question. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, it's kind of observation and inspired a little bit by Bill's gloom and doom scenario. Especially in the Musconetcong, in the northwestern part of the state, but I'll go out and say, especially in the Musconetcong, there's no way that we can ever separate groundwater from surface water in a watershed like ours with the karst geology. There's just we have to think of it as one system. And, I think we're getting better and better at doing that. And, maybe not the public at large, but certainly people who are out there monitoring, and policymakers and, folks like TU and the kind of work they're doing to, kind of really bring that connection forward by monitoring, you know, mapping out some of the groundwater. But what I was thinking of, I mean, you can feel, I think we can feel really helpless, because it seems like you know, the more knowledge we gain just keeps making us, you know, more aware of bad stuff, right? But I just wanted to say, and I you know, seeing this photo as well, kind of inspires it. This is Lake Musconetcong near the gravel parking lot, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so
That's right.
yeah. So, you know, when I look at this, anyone who knows me well is going to know what I'm going to say, which is that this is a dam impoundment and not a lake. And so many of our problems, you know, talk about exacerbating water temperature issues. I mean, you know, what would have been a couple hundred years ago, a stream that might have been maybe 20, 30 feet across and, you know, running through forests. So, you know, you wouldn't have this wide open water baking, right? So it also exacerbating your bacteria, you know, the HAB issue, all of that stuff. In a way, we've created, you know, well, obviously we've created the chemical monsters ourselves, but some of these other water quality issues, you know, are not only land use, but what we've done to the water itself. But, you know, I think it's promising that we're seeing more and more restoration projects that recognize, you know, that that we've done some pretty destructive things to our waterways. And now I think there's a growing trend to kind of right some of those wrongs. And I know that Keith has done some work on some dam removals, looking at temperature, and we can see temperature changes. You know, is it going to be enough in light of climate change? I don't know, but we can definitely see temperature changes where we see streams being restored. So that to me is kind of the brighter side. We're seeing, I think, more and more restoration, and importantly, more and more funders starting to fund restoration. So, and lastly, I'll say that we're just very lucky that we have this amount of monitoring happening, you know, on the Muskie, in the northwest part of the state, in the Raritan. You know, we're looking at these things. I mean, I think the vast majority of the country, you know, as far as what is happening in both surface and groundwater, that it's, you know, it's much more of a black box than we can see in this part of the state. And I just, thanks to all the speakers. I mean, everything you guys said was just, you know, it was very enlightening.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I want to just respond to that real quickly, because I, to some degree, kind of am in the same boat as you in terms of understanding that there's a looming threat of climate change, but being potentially hopeful, at least again from temperature's perspective, where I really focus my work, hopeful that restoration can, you know, maybe temper some of those impacts. And so I just wanted to give some just quick examples of how that might be possible. So as Beth mentioned, I do monitor lots of water temperatures above and below dams, above and below denuded riparian areas, so places where forests have been cut down along streams, and kind of as a map that Alan showed of all of our temperature points in the Muskie. We've been doing that across the Great Waters region. And we do see that there are temperature increases in streams above and below those, you know, human-made features that increase on the order of 6, 7, 8 degrees Celsius on average throughout the entire summer. And that's just a huge number for stream temperature increases over short distances. And that number actually does, you know, swamp a lot of the predicted temperature increases we might expect with climate change. So if we do restore some of those areas, we could think that maybe in those areas we could keep pace with climate change and even mitigate temperatures more than they'd be increasing over the next 50 years or so. And I guess just the big question is, can we do that at a scale that's large enough across our Great Waters region, across New Jersey, where it still actually matters to our main stem systems further downstream? And I definitely don't have the answer to that, but I think there is some hope through restoration.
Yeah, I think it is worth pointing out, everyone here did talk about TMDLs quite a bit. I mentioned the one on the Musconetcon for the bacteria. We have had some success, at least on one tributary where we worked with farmers cooperatively and with Trout Unlimited and some of the other groups in our area to bring down the bacteria from around 100,000 units per liter, which is extremely high when the level's supposed to be 235, down to levels where it can now attain. But it took about 20 plus years and quite a bit of public expenditure and private landowners chipping into and working to make that. And we will have a film coming out next year, probably around that, called West Portal Creek, which is the creek that this worked on. I think it shows the hope that Keith is talking about and Beth is talking about, that restoration can make improvements. But part of it is the scale. When you're looking at, like, when Doug and Mike are looking at the state and the impairments are lighting up across the state, increasing with time, we're creating a backlog for these ecosystem restoration projects to get to. And they do, some of them are quicker, like the dam removals can deliver a quicker water quality outcome, but they take years to plan and permit. Some of the work that Keith mentioned about repairing denuded riverbanks and adding shade can take quite a bit of work too. You're talking about a small tree, maybe 5 years old, being old enough to generate a good amount of shade, maybe 25 years or 50 years, depending upon the species. So there is promise. It seems like we're going to have a backlog to work out of. I saw that James had his hand up before. James, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. And my internet has been like spotty throughout this presentation, so just let me know if I need to repeat anything if I cut out. Thanks to the speakers. This was a great presentation discussion. On the affordable housing question, I have grown very accustomed over time to hearing affordable housing used as like kind of a cudgel to push through projects that maybe don't meet great affordable housing needs. Maybe it's a couple McMansions with a modicum of affordable housing on the lot, and used to kind of overcome environmental concerns about projects. However, I think recently, with the housing market being the way it was during COVID and the housing shortage coming to light nationally and in New Jersey, I've been thinking a lot about how environmental advocacy groups shape the conversation around affordable housing, acknowledging that there is a true need to meet housing demand in the state and nationally, while acknowledging the environmental risks of particularly high density developments in some of these really sensitive headwater areas that we've been talking about tonight. So I've been thinking about this for a couple of weeks now, and this is a great opportunity with all of our great presenters on the line to share their thoughts about this. What role do you see your organizations and environmental organizations in New Jersey having, shaping how this need is talked about in an environmentally sensitive way, and how affordable housing demands are met in an environmentally sensitive way, acknowledging that, I think as maybe Doug or Bill pointed out, that this development pressure is unlikely to go anywhere anytime soon with the current trajectory of the economy.
Yeah, that is a huge issue. So first, my group's position is really whether it's affordable housing or regular market rate. No development should happen in a way that's environmentally harmful. And I think our Mount Laurel doctrines will say it's not houses versus the environment. It's, houses in harmony with the environment. I know that's not necessarily how that is implemented. I think New Jersey needs to get a handle on how we build affordable housing. So by and large, it is through developers building market rate. So they build 4 market rate houses, or housing units for every market rate. So you are, if you have 100 affordable housing unit need, you're building 400, so 500 total units to meet that 100 need. So that's putting a tremendous pressure on communities that doesn't necessarily need to be there. And as Alan mentioned earlier, there was a complete breakdown in the way the system worked. And so it got thrown to the courts, which, being a lawyer, I like the courts, but it's not necessarily the best way to deal with things. And so we've seen just a heavy application level at the planning board and the zoning boards to get these things approved. We're going to very quickly, and probably in 2 years, start to deal with the next round of affordable housing. So we're going to see even more applications come in. So what the applications we're seeing right now is dealing with a need. Oh God, I think it goes back to 2010, 2012 through 2025. So in 2023, 2024, people are going to start thinking about the 2025 to 2030 round. And, maybe all of this gets built, maybe not all of it gets built, but, the decisions we're making today are going to have lasting repercussions going forward. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in and add to that, but we need to get a handle on it.
So James, I'll add a little bit on this. Things shifted to the courts when the Council on Affordable Housing basically stopped functioning. And that was the agency which was really trying to sort through some of these more technical issues of, well, where does the state plan apply with these rural sensitive areas that you maybe shouldn't cite such a large scale development, or an aquifer recharge area, maybe you shouldn't, build on that, or because you need to keep that drinking water safe. When it shifted to the courts, the courts are busy and they're overloaded and they don't want to get into a lot of minutia. And what had changed there was that then the burden shifted about how the public interest would be communicated. The Council for Affordable Housing wasn't there, so it was a group usually brings suit, a Fair Share Housing Center, for example, and then you would have the developer, maybe the town, but there wasn't somebody to communicate about water quality or species or habitat unless a private party paid for an expert to come and be present, because DEP wasn't showing up at these hearings. If DEP showed up and said, yes, this is where bobcat are, this is an environmentally sensitive area according to the state plan, this is where there's a stream, that would change the way that evidence is interpreted in the court. But it didn't play out that way. So there often isn't an advocate to speak up for what resources might be sensitive on a site. The other is that there's some parts of the Mount Laurel case history that really have been unexplored by the court. There's this intent to avoid conversion of a place with rural character into being very urban. But there's no definition nor test case that has come up challenging rural character. Who would be the expert to bring in the court setting to define this aesthetic of rural character when the court has not defined that definition itself? So that was the intent, but because it's a legal process and no one's defined it, there's no way to enforce it in the court, at least not yet. The other is the state plan has not been very effective. State plan identified rural areas and sensitive areas that development should be avoided. Well, with the state plan being from 2000 and the onward mechanism of a transfer development rights program where targeted growth areas would trade credits with areas that weren't supposed to grow never being implemented, the market mechanism intended in the plan never went into effect. So what happens with the affordable housing is a myriad of policy failures in it. And I think one thing that more simplistically could apply to the Great Waters region is that, for example, there's a regional growth factor that determines your housing need for affordable housing. It's partly based upon your population and partly based upon job growth on a regionalized area. The region for the southern part of the Musconetcon includes Hunterdon County, Somerset, and Middlesex. So if jobs grow in New Brunswick, there's a regionalized housing need for those 3 counties and all the municipalities for New Brunswick's job growth, even if Hunterdon County is losing population. If you change that from east-west to north-south, Sussex, Warren, Hunterdon, just that regional job growth factor would dramatically change the affordable housing numbers and reflect more what the labor and housing demand is for this part of the state. That's probably the easiest fix I've ever thought of about it. And it looks like Bill or Mike was.
Yeah, I was gonna say that sort of region grouping is not unique to you. So Hopewell Township is lumped in with Ocean and Middlesex, which was some of the fastest growing counties in the state. So the numbers get skewed.
That's right.
Arguably that way.
Yeah, James, I'm not an affordable housing expert by any stretch of the imagination. So having said that, I'm going to opine on this anyways. It seems to me that the problem is pretty straightforward, and that is that courts suck at administering their own decisions. That's not what they're for. That's the function of the executive branch. And whenever courts get involved in administering their own decisions, whether it's affordable housing or anything else, the result is precisely what we see here, a program that is dysfunctional. The solution to that is to create an effective agency in the executive branch that is responsible for a statewide strategic plan for affordable housing and for implementing it, because the market will not do it. That's why we need an affordable housing program. The reason we don't have adequate affordable housing in New Jersey, or pretty much, pick a state in the US, is because the market isn't there for it. The market demand in my watershed is for McMansions. At least it was prior to 2008. And nobody's going to build affordable housing when they can sell McMansions, right? So we need intervention to make that happen. And we've got to have a government agency that can do that effectively. The one we had did not. It was a failure. And that's why it wound up back in the courts. That solution needs to include all the stakeholders. That includes the people who need affordable housing. It has to include the employers. Where do I need people? Where is the employment for folks? Where is the transportation for folks? And it needs to include the environmental community. And we need to be careful to make sure that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot. One of the issues I have with high density development in my watershed is that we don't have a lot. There are very few places where we have public sewer in my watershed. About 2/3 of my watershed is on septic. So when they build these units, even if they're fairly high density units, they wind up going on a batch system, like basically a giant septic system. And then that system gets turned over to the homeowners association. That's a disaster waiting to happen. I've got failing septics all over my watershed. I don't need a 60,000 gallon a day septic system being built to fail. What I need is, if we're gonna get serious about affordable housing, is to tie those units into public sewer. And it's our fault. For decades, we in the environmental community said, don't extend sewers, because if you build it, the developers will be on top of it and there'll just be more development. And that we've got to find a better way to do that. It's an issue. We've got to address it. We need to be part of the solution instead of fighting it all the time. And I get frustrated when I get calls from members or folks in the community who don't want an affordable housing unit in their area just because they don't want affordable housing there, not for any, not for a real rational reason. But the bottom line for us, as Mike and Alan said, I'm paraphrasing here, but don't put affordable housing in a place that you wouldn't put unaffordable housing. if you wouldn't allow somebody to build a McMansion there, don't put a 14-unit condo there.
I haven't seen other questions that are unaddressed or hands that have been raised. I'm wondering if folks want to have a chance to wrap up or provide any other concluding thoughts, because what I want to do next is I want to get to the part where we can talk about what individuals can do to help with these water quality challenges our state has.
So
All right.
I'll jump in. I'll take that invitation, Alan. So I appreciate it, right? It doesn't mean we all need to have kind of closing statements here, but I appreciate the time we've all spent. And I think this is just a valuable forum, because obviously the questions we're getting into are pretty big, right? What are the long-term impacts for not just the great watersheds? What are the long-term impacts for our water supply? What are the impacts of climate change? What's the future of kind of our housing market across the state? These are questions we do need to wrestle with. And I think one of the other challenges, and Alan, you were discussing, and Keith, you were referencing this too, some of the successes obviously are at the local level, right? And when you talk about what motivates people, what gets people kind of up and out, right? It's recreational use of waterways. It's about feeling that affinity for literally their community. And it's about being able to make that connection between, a development or a dam or, dare I say, climate change to impacting that water quality, right? And that's, I think, when things kind of click. And that's the key for kind of local organizing. And obviously what happens at the local level influences state policy. So we kind of spent a good chunk of this earlier presentation talking about, quite frankly, just the failures at the state level, right? The ability to kind of pass the buck along, even when we're seeing impairments rise across the state, and especially in the great watersheds. Those are, that should be the kind of the alarm bell for DEP. And, we are on the cusp of seeing DEP coming out with some pretty far-reaching regulations to be able to, protect water quality that take into account climate change, that take into account just kind of the changing matter of land use. And so that's I think the thing that kind of always motivates me is that we don't see kind of the change in state policy until unless we have examples on the local level of impacts, right? That's always what we hear from legislators is I got a call, or I in my town, I saw this. That's obviously what IDA did for so many of us, is that it kind of brought the impact of flooding, not that we didn't know it was there, but now it's something that, was literally creating thousands of wet basements and worse across the state. Those are obviously problems that aren't going away. We're not going to solve all of them overnight, but being able to point to the solutions that work on the local level and making sure when we can't solve them on the local level, the failure of the commons, that's when we need to have protections at the state level. And obviously the ultimate federal backstop, the Clean Water Act. So I could go on, but please, I'll pass the baton.
Yeah, and just to mention that Cindy did add in the chat that thinking about, we're having a great conversation here. This is a statewide issue and even regional, local issue. How do we get more people engaged in the conversation? So,
yeah, so I'm going to sort of take what we can do and sort of wrap up. As I mentioned, we had waters that were on fire and were basically just dumping grounds and we cleaned that up. So we did the low-hanging fruit. What we're now struggling with is that more diffuse, more difficult issue of how we develop our land and how that impacts our water. And that is a much more difficult thing, something that, in New Jersey, we're, 2004 or 1980 is really when we started looking at this kind of stuff. So it's weird to think something that's 30 or 40 years old is, new, but it is new. And what, we also are seeing and this is sort of what we can do. So it's more of a how are we interfacing with our land? And we're deciding that municipality by municipality by municipality, with very little thought or interaction with our neighbors in our neighboring municipalities. And a lot of the residents or towns that have reached out to me since Ida are talking about, how do I solve this when no one else upstream of me is fixing this either? And so how do we bring municipalities together to start to talk regionally? And one of the things you try to wrap your head around, New Jersey has 365 municipalities that have what's called the MS4 permit. So that's their permit to discharge stormwater, collect, treat, and discharge. Everyone else has on regions or counties, so Maryland may have 4 of these MS4 permits, so they are acting more regionally. So I would say to us, we have to think, how do we take the tools that we have? What tools do we need? And how do we get the towns to start talking to each other and integrating and planning together? There was a town that a mayor who was up for re-election was boasting that he put all the warehouses on the edge of the town because the town got the tax benefits, but the routes to the major highways were in neighboring municipalities. So the host town got the tax benefits, the neighboring towns got all of the detriments and had no say in the process. So we got to really start thinking more regionally. How do we get our elected officials to think more regionally to start solving these problems? And with that, I'll get off the soapbox.
Yeah, Alan, you might get the impression that I'm like a pessimist about this stuff, but I'm really not. I feel obliged to point that out. If I didn't have hope, I wouldn't do this. I wouldn't be able to get up in the morning and do this. And I get cranky about it. I acknowledge that, but I get cranky about it because I care, because I know we're capable of better. I know what people are capable of. I've seen it. I know we have the ability to address these things. So I'm optimistic that with the proper motivation and the proper leadership, people will take action. In the simplest terms, what people can do to make a difference is to join an organization that works on things that are important for them. Join your local watershed association, join Trout Unlimited, whatever the organization is that works for you, and write a check. And that's it. Join up, write a check. This stuff is incredibly complicated. I get that. You don't have to worry about the complications. Just do your little bit and write a check. And to Cindy's question about, how do we communicate with people? I'm not exactly sure how, because I'm not the world's best at media and social media, but I think the key for us is to be ready to communicate with people every time it floods our communities. We need to flood their social media. Every time we get an Ida or a Sandy or an Irene or a Lee, and they'll keep coming. Every time we get one of those, we need to flood people with our message. That's the time to get it out, because that's when people are paying attention to water, and we need to jump on it.
Yeah.
Keith, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, Alan, you can take it away with the next section.
All right. I am going to move on to a little bit about the policies that can protect water quality. We actually covered a lot of them already. So this will be a little bit more review here. So, kind of coming back to where I started out, what changed in this time period? And, one of the key things that changes, how we protect our waters. So the approach to the public and trust of a water resource changed. And we're not going to change New Jersey's geography from the East Coast, from being between two major cities. We're always going to have those pressures, but the ways that we collectively decide how to protect public resources like water change in this time period. And it's not just the state level. I mean, this county and municipal layers here too. And what we're trying to do through the Great Waters Project is identify those recreational waters, those waters that have the National Wild Scenic Rivers, that have the native brook trout, that have the stock trout, or have the investments of being a wildlife management area on both sides, or a county park, or a national recreation area. So with Trout Unlimited, we've come up with a criteria, and we've mapped that out. And one of the things that we're hoping for is that New Jersey might advance that definition of what that exceptional recreational water is I mentioned, that led us to coin the phrase Great Waters, so that we can hopefully better protect these resources from degradation, that these resources are taken into account when planning decisions are made. So what we're hoping is that we'll see some movement in the future around protecting recreational waters. We'll get some more attention to what Beth called the black box of how the surface and groundwaters interact. We'll have some better identification of these headwater streams, and that we're make sure that we're protecting known drinking water supplies and groundwaters, and waters in the Highlands region that are used for drinking water. And part of what we're trying to do is also, reach out to the municipality so that they can target their zoning and, be cognizant of what potential water impacts or flooding impacts could be. So what can folks do? This is one of our staff, Krista, who does the water quality work. This is like Keith goes out in the water. Bill Kibler has staff that go out in the water too. So what can folks do? So first thing is appreciate the waters. Go out, join us for a trip. We'll be having more of a trip calendar in the spring, and looking at paddling trips, hiking trips, fishing options too. We have resources where you can learn more about issues like the connection of groundwater and surface water, or how to keep the drinking water safe, or how to protect recreational waters. And we have a way for people to share their stories too. This is one of Keith's colleagues from Trout Unlimited, and she has a great story. She put herself through college being a kayak guide. She grew up fishing. It was something she really loved to do, and that motivated her to go to college, get an environmental science degree. And now she's one of those folks who's an environmental professional, working at Trout Unlimited, trying to protect the habitats and the fish that she caught as a kid, and would like her kids in the future to catch too. And what folks can do, we do have a petition on our Great Waters website. It's very simple, takes about 30 seconds to put that together. And we're also interested in folks who would like to talk with their local officials about water quality issues. You can volunteer. Just like Bill said, you can also contribute your expertise, your time, or financially. We also have projects to put in those trees along the riverbanks, help keep the banks stable, help shade the water, and keep it cool. We're always looking for folks to help out with that. And if you want to learn more about the project, or you want to get in touch with any of the speakers, maybe we went through the contact information too quick, you can reach out to me. And we have some great resources on our website, including recreational maps showing you where those 118 plus river access points are across this region, as well as some of the other policies that we talked about tonight. With that, it is 8:55. I'd like to thank Doug, Keith, Bill, and Mike for joining in the presentation tonight. We really appreciate your expertise and perspective. And it's always great to be able to get folks who have the legal background to share their insights that they've learned along the way, specialized expertise there. And let's see, I'm just checking the chats here if we have anything else. No, more kudos are there. And with that, I'd like to conclude for tonight. If folks do have any follow-up questions, please get in touch with me and I can get them to the right people. So thank you for joining us, everyone. Yay. We'd be clapping if we were in person.
Thank you, Alan.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Alan.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. We're
Yeah.
glad you could join us tonight.
Have a great night,
everybody.
everybody.
Have a good night.
All right. Bye-bye.